All right, moving on to item 10C. Adopt resolution approving a work plan to develop a green infrastructure plan in accordance with provision C.3.J of the San Francisco Bay Regional Water Quality Control Board's municipal regional permit.
Good evening, Honorable Vice Mayor and members of the City Council. For this item tonight, we have a presentation from Matt Fabry, who is the program manager with the San Mateo Countywide Water Pollution Prevention Program, to provide an overview of the need for the green infrastructure plan, and which is being required by the Regional Water Quality Control Board and the Municipal Regional Permit. We're bringing this item tonight because the Regional Board is requiring the agencies to develop a green infrastructure plan that demonstrates how each agency will gradually shift from traditional gray storm drain infrastructure, which channels pollutants runoff directly into the receiving water without treatment, to a more resilient and sustainable storm drain system comprised of green infrastructure, which captures, stores, and treats stormwater using specially designed landscape systems. Approved work plan it's being required by the board as well, which needs to be completed by June 30th, 2017. And the work plan is attached in a staff report for your information. And the work plan details the various activities necessary for creating a green infrastructure plan, complying with the MRP requirements, and indicates which aspects of the green infrastructure plan will be undertaken by CCAG, and as well as by the city, and the overall schedule. And some of the requirements in the plan includes planning and prioritization of projects, a development process for tracking completed projects, developing overall green infrastructure guidelines, detailed designs, specifications, and updating planning documents, and conducting outreach and education to public and staff. The plan must be developed and submitted to the regional board in September 2019, and allocation of sufficient resources to ensure timely development of a plan is needed as well. And the cost for the development of the plan is anticipated to be between $100,000 to $150,000, but it's currently unknown until the city obtains proposal from firms through a request for proposal process. And staff has included a proposed appropriation of $150,000 in the fiscal year 17-18 budget for this development of this plan. So now I'll turn it over to Matt, who will provide you with more information.
Good evening, Mr. Vice Mayor and members of the council. I'm Matt Fabry. I work for the City County Association of Governments, or CCAG. I manage the countywide stormwater program, where we work with all of the 21 agencies in the county to help them comply with these regional stormwater permit requirements. So I'm pleased to be here this evening to talk to you in more detail about the green infrastructure planning requirements.
Good. Welcome.
So when we talk about stormwater, what's the big deal with stormwater? As Director Tan mentioned, when it rains, first of all, we've created a lot of hard surfaces as we've urbanized a lot of impervious areas, and we've created a lot of pollutants. And when it rains, all of those pollutants get washed directly into our storm drain system, which then flows directly to our creeks, to the bay, to the ocean without any form of treatment. So all those pollutants go directly out to our water bodies and cause problems for aquatic life. It causes problems for aesthetics. It causes problems for human health that we'll talk about. So that's the overall issue with stormwater. So this is showing what things used to be like before we came in and urbanized. So this is showing that pre-development, when it rained, you'd have fairly significant amounts of evapotranspiration where the water is taken up by plants and respired. You've got a significant amount of infiltration into the ground, which helps to recharge groundwater. And you've got minimal surface flow that's running off of the landscape based on this being more permeable surfaces. Then when we came in and paved over most of the areas, we've really reduced the amount of infiltration, we've really reduced the amount of evapotranspiration, and we've significantly increased the amount of surface flow into our underground pipe system that goes directly to our receiving waters. When we talk about pollutants, it's really just about anything you could think about that could come in contact with stormwater when it rains, from trash and litter, which are things everybody sees and can understand, to things like pesticides, nutrients, and fertilizers that you may be applying to your lawns or your gardens. I'm going to talk more about mercury and PCBs in a minute. When you have construction sites, they've got a lot of construction-related materials that can get washed away when it rains. We've got a lot of vehicle-related pollutants, including metals like copper from brake pads, zinc from tires. We've got oil and hydrocarbons from oil and fluids that leak from vehicles. Even when you wash your car, you could be potentially washing these pollutants from vehicles into the storm drain system. We've also got problems with bacteria, a lot of it related to people not picking up after their pets, that can cause problems at beaches and recreational areas. But we also have problems not necessarily in San Bruno, but over on the coast side with livestock, and there could be potential for sewer overflows and sewer systems leaking that can also cause bacteria to get into our storm drain system. And even flow is a problem. As I mentioned, because we've created so many impervious surfaces, we've significantly increased the amount of flow that's leaving these areas and going into our creeks. That's why most of our creeks at this point are hardened channels, because if we didn't have the hardened channels, the significant amount of flow would completely erode those water bodies, plus we've built up basically to the edges of the creeks. So we've got a regional stormwater permit. We call it the municipal regional permit that's issued by the San Francisco Bay Regional Water Quality Control Board, which is a state agency. It's issued to 76 municipal permittees in the Bay Area. All of the cities, towns in the county and San Mateo County are covered under it, as well as the folks you can see up there in the list. And this permit addresses the full spectrum of stormwater issues that you could imagine. The permit's, is 300 pages or something like that. So it's a significant document that covers a lot of things, from municipal activities, making sure that your staff, when they're doing things out in the public right-of-way, are not causing problems. It deals with commercial businesses, deals with construction sites. We've got requirements to do water quality monitoring throughout the county. We have to do public outreach and education. There are requirements on new and redevelopment, so that any significant project of any decent size these days is required to put in on-site stormwater management now. So we're gradually starting to transform the urbanized area with more sustainable stormwater management. And then we've got a bunch of requirements dealing with specific pollutants of concern that I'll talk about a couple of those in greater detail. Specifically mercury and PCBs. PCBs stands for polychlorinated biphenyls. Both of these pollutants are causing problems in the bay, where they're accumulating in fish tissues at levels that make it unsafe to eat fish from the bay. Some fish are not safe to eat it at any frequency, and some fish are recommended to be eaten at reduced frequencies. Mercury was sort of a legacy issue associated with gold mining, but it's actually still an ongoing problem. We've actually got mercury blowing over from China from coal-fired power plants and then depositing on our impervious surfaces. Very low levels everywhere, but cumulatively it results in a large load to the bay. PCBs was an industrial material that it's oil, and it was a non-conductive lubricant, so it was used extensively in electrical equipment. It was also used as a plasticizing agent in caulks and sealants, and so it's tied up in buildings. So it was used extensively. It's now banned, but it's found throughout the environment when we go out and collect samples. As I mentioned, it's in fish tissues, significant levels. So we've got significant reductions required in both of these pollutants as part of the regional permit. It's important to understand that mercury and PCBs both attach strongly to sediment and particles, and so if we can put things out there in the environment that collect and filter out those particles before it goes into our water bodies, then we're helping to remove the mercury and PCBs. So this is just an example of some of the public outreach that's related to mercury and PCBs, showing recommendations in terms of fish to be consumed safely and fish that are not safe to eat. So I don't want to have you focus in on this big list, but basically when we talk about mercury and PCBs, there's sort of three areas of control that we're looking at. Either source controls, where you find a source of these things and you deal with the source. Downstream interception, which I'm going to talk about more, is where we intercept the pollutants before it gets out into our receiving waters. And then we also have some focus on outreach and recommending to the public risk reduction measures so that they aren't catching fish from the bay and consuming them. So I'm going to talk more about this downstream interception, specifically the stormwater treatment aspect and green infrastructure. And so when we talk about green infrastructure, we're really talking about natural systems, landscape type systems that capture, treat, and infiltrate stormwater. It's sort of restoring the natural stormwater management that we used to have before we disturbed the created the urbanized environment. It's typically going to be distributed small-scale systems where we're collecting stormwater in small amounts all throughout the environment. And using green infrastructure is really a multi-benefit approach that addresses a lot of issues. First of all, it can help with adapting to climate change impacts. We know with climate change that precipitation patterns are going to change. We may see a lot more intense storms in the future. So having a green infrastructure system in place is going to help to to mitigate some of those impacts from climate change. It's also going to help with existing flooding issues because you're going to be reducing the amount of stormwater that's flowing out into our storm drain systems and our channels. And it can also help with groundwater recharge. As we're capturing water and infiltrating it into the ground, it can get down into the groundwater basins that are then providing a more resilient, sustainable local water supply. When we talk about green infrastructure, we are talking about both public projects within the public right-of-way and public parcels, as I mentioned, these permit requirements now require private projects as they redevelop or new development, they put in green infrastructure systems to manage stormwater from their sites. So this just shows schematically what we're talking about. This is a more balanced approach where we've got more infiltration, more evapotranspiration. We're never going to get back to the pre-development conditions, but we can get to something that's more balanced than what we have now. So I want to show some examples of what this looks like, and this is actually, San Bruno was one of the early adopters when CCAG provided funding for pilot projects back in 2009, 2010, and your staff submitted a project to build this vegetated curb extension on 3rd Street, I believe it is, in San Bruno, that's right next to the National Guard Armory. And so this is an example of where they bumped out into the roadway, and so normally the flow goes right down the gutter, and now it is intercepted in this landscaped area. It's allowed to pond up, 4 to 6 inches, and then it infiltrates into the ground. And so you've got additional greening and trees as associated with that project. This is an example of City of Brisbane where they put in this large rain garden as part of their City Hall retrofit project, and it now captures all of the runoff from their parking lot as well as some of the runoff from the roof of their City Hall building. Provides a very nice vegetated landscaped amenity as you come to City Hall. This is Daly City. They put in a series of rain gardens next to the Ceremony Library. It takes runoff from the parking lot for the library as well as adjacent playing fields. And then this is in Burlingame, another example where they did a large rain garden in a parking lot as well as a vegetated curb extension out in the roadway. So this captures runoff from parking lot as well as some of the buildings on Burlingame Avenue drain out to the back of the properties and through the parking lot, as well as they're capturing some of the street runoff on Donnelly Avenue. So these are just some examples of what green infrastructure looks like. And so I wanted to just dive into what the permit requires. As Director Tan mentioned, the permit requires that all agencies develop a green infrastructure plan that's showing how you're going to gradually shift from our traditional flood control-based storm drain systems where we try to get the water away from us as fast as possible to something that's more green and sustainable where we capture it in small amounts and deal with it where it falls. So we're required to prioritize and map areas where you have potential for projects to implement green infrastructure. We're supposed to identify specific timeframes in which those projects are potentially going to be built. We have to develop design guidelines, details, and standard specifications, especially focused on projects in the public right-of-way for how green infrastructure will be implemented. Cities are required to amend all of their other relevant plans. This would include things like your general plan, the specific plan that was talked about on the previous item. These plans need to incorporate green infrastructure into those plans as appropriate. We're required to evaluate funding options for how we're going to pay for this. As you can imagine, this is not going to be cheap to do all of this. And cities are required to adopt any relevant policies or ordinances to ensure that you've got the authority to implement the plan once it's developed. We're supposed to do public outreach, staff training, and educate elected officials, which hopefully I'm doing a little bit of that tonight for the three of you. There's a requirement for early implementation, what the Water Board calls no missed opportunities. So as projects are happening during this current 5-year permit term, they want to see you looking for opportunities to incorporate green infrastructure into those projects during this 5-year permit term. And we're required to participate in processes at the regional and statewide level to promote green infrastructure. So the last two things that are the most important, first is that each agency must adopt a work plan for developing their green infrastructure plan by July 1st of this year, which is the action item before you tonight, is to approve a work plan for the city. And then you have to submit your final green infrastructure plan to the Water Board as part of your annual report that goes in September of 2019. So we've got a couple years to develop the plan. CCAG is working with our consultants to help all of you agencies to develop these plans. We're developing a lot of model documents. The work plan that is included in your agenda report was a model work plan that we put together with our consultants. So we're doing a lot of the work to try to help cities as much as possible in developing these plans. But ultimately, there's a certain point where it's going to have to shift back to the local agencies to take it through a local planning process and do community engagement at the local level. And then the last thing is the real kicker on all of this is that the Water Board is saying that we have to collectively show that by implementing these plans, we're going to achieve actual specific numeric reductions in mercury and PCBs, both by 2020, which is the end of this current permit term, as well as by 2040. And so that's the real piece that's the challenge, is that it's one thing to develop a plan and say that you'll do your best to implement it, but it's another thing to say you have to adopt a plan and you have to show that you're going to actually achieve specific reductions in these pollutants, which really puts a hook on you that if you don't implement it, you're going to be out of compliance with the permit and subject to potential enforcement. So I wanted to close with this slide that probably nobody can read, so I apologize for that. It's the best I could pull together, but this is a slide that we've been working on to show all of the agencies in the county what we think things look like in terms of meeting the 2020 load reduction requirements. And I'll just jump to the conclusion for San Bruno is that of the countywide total that we're supposed to achieve, the current default in the permit is that we distribute that countywide total on a population basis. So the permit establishes a countywide number, and then the default, as I said, is to distribute that to the agencies on a population basis. So San Bruno is required to achieve 26 grams per year reduction in PCBs. This is just looking at PCBs out of our countywide total of 370. So we're showing, based on everything that your staff has told us in terms of how much new and redevelopment is going to happen over the next 5 years, as well as a separate program that I won't get into the details of trying to deal with building demolitions and keeping PCBs from building demolitions out of the environment. We're showing that San Bruno is only going to potentially get to about 18 grams per year. So that's a fairly significant deficit, even though we're talking about grams. It's not a lot, but to get from 18 to 26 may be a big jump. And so I just want to make clear to the council that implementation is going to be a big issue, and figuring out how collectively everybody in the county is going to get this stuff implemented. I think it's important for you to start thinking about that, and I think it's important to start thinking about how much new and redevelopment is going to happen. Make sure that your staff is given, the best information about how much new and redevelopment is going to happen. But it's also, I think, important to think about where are the opportunities to do green infrastructure within roadway projects that are already planned so that you can incorporate GI into these other planned investments. But also potentially think about things like your neighbors in South San Francisco are doing, where they are considering a regional project at Orange Memorial Park that would capture drainage from a very large acreage on Colma Creek, and looking at that project as something that would help with potential downstream flooding issues and treat a large amount of area at one time, and it may be more cost effective to do that. So I know San Bruno does have some storm drainage issues and flooding issues, and so there may be opportunities for you to look at some of those larger scale regional projects. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Any questions for Mr. Fabry? I have a question. You made very clear on how much poison is out there on our surfaces, PCBs and things, and then you show examples of how you're going to collect that and just drain them into these, actual very attractive landscape yards.
Right.
What are these contaminants doing to those landscaped areas?
Well, as I mentioned,
what is the treatment?
Yeah, so the treatment on these is, as I mentioned, that these pollutants attach strongly to sediments and particles. And so the treatment that we're achieving is that we're forcing the water to go into these areas. We're designing them so that they have a certain amount of ponding capacity, and they've got specially designed soils and plants that allow the water to infiltrate fairly rapidly. And so you're getting the treatment through filtering out the particles as it filters through the soil. So you're using sort of a natural filtration system within the soils and the plant material that's in there to filter out these pollutants. Any one of these individual projects is going to be treating a relatively small drainage area. These projects are looking at something on the scale of a city block or a parking lot. And so the pollutants that are going to be coming off of any of those areas are going to be pretty small in terms of the overall quantity. And part of the issue is that the concerns in terms of looking at water quality impacts from these pollutants is that we look at much lower concentrations of these pollutants than we look at from a human health standpoint, because they bioaccumulate in these aquatic organisms, and then they get eaten by bigger organisms, and it gradually goes up the food chain and continues to accumulate. And so when it gets to fish that we are consuming, it has high levels that are a concern from a public health standpoint. But so we're concerned about water quality levels of these concentrations that are much lower than they are from a human health standpoint. So I don't think that in any of these facilities you're going to accumulate pollutants in any level that's going to be any concern from a human health standpoint of anybody that's walking around in there, or kids that might go in and play in one of these things. I don't think there's going to be any concern from that standpoint. It may be that over decades that we may need to go in and dig these things out and put in new soils and replace them if there was accumulation of pollutants. But mostly what we're seeing is that the pollutants accumulate in the top inch or two of the soil.
And also, I'm wondering, are you familiar with with our creek that runs through the park and collects all the water? So, how significant would it be if that we would say filter that? Say when we do get significant rain, significant storms, and it flows heavily for days.
Yeah. I mean, I think parks are great opportunities, especially when you do have a creek flowing right through a park, is that, especially if you've got a potential park retrofit in the works, is that's a perfect opportunity to potentially put in a large underground retention system where you could divert flow from a channel into an underground system where you can capture large volumes, you can gradually let it infiltrate into the ground. So it's important to look at whether those opportunities exist. They cost a lot of money to put those in. The one in South San Francisco, and we've got another one in Atherton that's being looked at being put in at an elementary school. So schools are also a good opportunity. Those are multiple millions of dollars to put those in, but we've actually got cooperative funding from Caltrans for both of those projects, and Caltrans has funding to spend on some of these projects because they have statewide impacts on water quality. They're subject to regulations all over the state, and so they've basically negotiated an agreement that they need to treat a certain number of acres per year, and so they're incentivized to work with local agencies to find some of these cooperative opportunities. And so that may be an opportunity in San Bruno if you've got a park that you've got a channel running through it, and if you've got potentially a retrofit opportunity for the park, you could potentially get funding from an entity like Caltrans, or there's grant funds that are out there that are looking for those types of projects. So I think that you could, kill a lot of birds with one stone in terms of water quality improvement as well as flood reduction, mitigation, things like that.
Kill the birds instead of the fish. Any other questions for the consultant or was for staff? Anyone else like to speak on this? Mr. Seymour.
So when I was looking at the requirements, I didn't see anything up there on the maintenance of these. Is that part of the requirements from the county to the city when these are developed? Is that the city creates a way to maintain them?
Yeah. Maintenance is an issue that always comes up on these issues, and to be clear, the requirements come from the state to the cities, and so the county is not mandating this. My agency is trying to help in terms of developing these plans, but yes, implementation is going to be a big part of it. And so if you start putting these things into your public rights of way or into your parks, there is going to be a maintenance component that's going to have to happen with that. And so I think it's going to be an issue of identifying funding not only for the capital costs but also for the long-term O&M.
So the answer is yes, the city maintains.
Yeah, thank you. That's because the piece down there on 3rd Avenue for a very long time was a dump site, not a garden. So if the site's being used, if it's not maintained and things are going into it and then we're using the runoff into it, are we accomplishing what we're trying to do?
Sure.
These things definitely need to be maintained in order for them to function properly, and that was one thing that came to my attention was that the project in San Bruno that we had funded, I think there was some staff turnover and it sort of fell off San Bruno's radar in terms of it being something that the city needed to maintain. And so we made that clear to San Bruno that CCAG didn't fund that with the intention that it was going to be left to turn into a weed patch or something like that. So I think staff, my understanding is staff has gone out and tried to get that back in shape. But it is something that if you don't maintain these things properly, then they do stop functioning. And so there is a certain amount of maintenance. They are landscape features, so generally a lot of it is standard landscaping maintenance. But they also do a great job of collecting trash, which is another requirement that all cities are forced with dealing with. And so they does require going in periodically and cleaning out trash and things like that to keep them functional.
My last statement is I think this is wonderful. I mean, there's a lot of things that we could do and Ken, what you were talking about in the park, I see your brain working, some things that we might be able to do in the park, where we could get a big bang for the buck. If we have to get to 26%, it seems like we need to go for some large areas as well, but I just ask that we maintain them.
Yeah. Thank you. Any other questions? If not, okay. Mr. Braun.
Just my statement is just beware, because I grew up a lot of the southern part of the United States, and these are great, but you have to make sure that whoever's doing this also is concerned with. I realize we're concerned with the bay, but you have to also be concerned with the groundwater table, because I've known cities to where they put in this and it's not been put in right, and it's messed with the local water table. So and there's a couple of them that are here locally that are having problems because of stuff that they've done. So you might want to make sure that's something they do when they're doing, especially the big projects.
Okay. I'm sure engineering, public works will look at that in a technical sense. Any further discussion? If not, the recommendation is adopt a resolution approving the work plan.
Go ahead and introduce the resolution for adoption.
Councilmember Rico Medina.
Aye.
Councilmember Marty Medina.
Aye.
Councilmember O'Connell. Oops, excuse me.
She's in bed.
Vice Mayor Ibarra.
Aye.